You are in Florence, Italy, in the year 1348, living as a young physician apprentice in a world where death walks the streets, like a merchant selling his wares to anyone with coin enough to pay. The stench of tomorrow. Imagine waking to the sound of wheels grinding against cobblestones. But instead of merchants bringing fresh bread and wine, the carts carry bodies stacked like firewood. This was my reality on that October morning when I first understood that our world had ended without anyone bothering to announce it properly. My name is Caterina Rossi, and I was 22 years old when I learned that being alive was not a right, but a temporary privilege that could be revoked without notice. I lived in the heart of Florence, in a narrow house that smelled of dried herbs and desperate hope, working as an apprentice to Master Giovanni, the most respected physician in our quarter. At least, he had been respected until people started dying faster than he could bleed them. The morning that changed everything began like any other, which is to say, terribly. I descended the wooden stairs of our house, my bare feet finding the cold stone floor of our workshop. The air was thick with the scent of burning rosemary and sage, Master Giovanni's latest attempt to purify the evil humors that, according to him, were causing this mysterious plague. But underneath those familiar smells lurked something else, the sweet, cloying odor of decay that had begun to permeate our entire city. Through the small window, I could see our neighbor, Signora Benedetta, dumping the contents of her chamber pot into the street while calling out the traditional warning, "Attention below." But her voice cracked with exhaustion, and I noticed she did not wait for a response before emptying the vessel. Such small breakdowns in civility were becoming common as death made everyone hurry. Master Giovanni was already awake, hunched over his precious manuscripts, searching for answers that seemed to dance just beyond our understanding. His grey hair had grown wilder in recent weeks, and his hands shook as he traced the ancient texts with his finger. Galen's theories, Hippocrates' wisdom, Avicenna's careful observations, none of them had prepared us for what was happening. "Caterina," he said without looking up, "go to the market and see if anyone has news from Genoa. The merchants there might know something about this pestilence." I wrapped my woolen cloak around my shoulders and stepped into the street, but I did not make it 10 paces before I saw something that made my blood freeze in my veins. Our neighbor's son, little Marco, who had been playing in the mud just yesterday, now sat slumped against his family's door. At first I thought he was sleeping, but then I saw the swollen masses beneath his arms, dark and grotesque, straining against his small tunic. The buboes, we had heard whispers of them, these terrible swellings that appeared on the bodies of the afflicted, but seeing them on a child I had watched grow up made them real in a way that all of Master Giovanni's texts could not. Marco's breathing was shallow and rapid, and when he opened his eyes to look at me, I saw not the mischievous boy who used to steal apples from our tree, but something ancient and knowing, as if death had already begun to speak through him. "Signora Caterina," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "it hurts." I knelt beside him, my training warring with my fear. Everything I had learned told me to examine the swellings, to determine their nature and severity, but every instinct screamed at me to run. The Black Death, as some had begun calling it, was spreading through our city like spilled wine through fine cloth, and no one knew how to stop it. "Where is your mother, Marco?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "Inside," he said, and then, with the devastating honesty of children, "She does not move any more." My hands trembled as I reached for him, but before I could touch his fevered forehead, a strong grip seized my wrist. I looked up to see Master Giovanni, his face grave and pale. "Step away, Caterina," he said firmly. "We cannot help him, and we must not contaminate ourselves. But he is just a child. He is already dead." Master Giovanni interrupted, his voice heavy with a sorrow that had been growing heavier each day. "And if we do not learn to protect ourselves, we will join him before the sun sets." As we backed away from little Marco, I felt something crack inside my chest, not my ribs, but something more essential. Perhaps my faith in the natural order, or my belief that good people were protected by God's grace. Because if a child like Marco could be struck down so cruelly, then none of us were safe. That was when I noticed the rats. They were everywhere, scurrying along the walls of houses, dead in the gutters, their bodies swollen with the same mysterious sickness that was claiming our neighbors. But what struck me was not their presence. Rats had always shared our cities, but their behavior. They seemed frantic, desperate, as if they too understood that something fundamental had changed in the world. Master Giovanni grabbed my arm and pulled me back toward our house. "We are leaving Florence," he said, his voice urgent. "Today, pack only what you can carry, and tell no one where we are going." Leaving. I stared at him in shock. "But the people need us. We are physicians. We are the only physicians left," he corrected grimly. "Master Pietro died 3 days ago. Master Francesco has fled to Rome, and Master Alessandro... He shuddered. "Alessandro tried to treat the pestilence with his own hands, and now he lies in the Santa Maria cemetery with buboes the size of apples covering his body." As we reached our door, I turned back to look at Marco one last time. He had closed his eyes, and his breathing had become even more labored. I wanted to run to him, to hold his hand, to whisper prayers in his ear, but Master Giovanni's grip on my arm tightened, and I allowed myself to be pulled inside. "Pack quickly," he said, already gathering his most precious books. "We have perhaps an hour before the panic truly begins. When people realize how many have died in the night, there will be chaos in the streets." As if summoned by his words, a scream pierced the morning air, a woman's voice raw with grief and terror. Then another scream, and another. From our window, I could see people emerging from their houses, some carrying bundles, others simply standing in the street as if unsure what to do with their suddenly uncertain lives. "Where will we go?" I asked, stuffing herbs and medical instruments into a leather satchel. "North," Master Giovanni replied, his hands moving quickly among his books. "To my brother's monastery outside Siena. The monks there have ancient knowledge of healing, and perhaps in isolation, we can understand what God is trying to tell us." But as I watched him select which precious texts to abandon and which to save, I wondered if God was trying to tell us anything at all, or if he had simply turned his face away and left us to face the darkness alone. The wheels of the death carts continued their grinding song outside our window, and I realized that the sound would follow us wherever we went, because this was not just Florence's death, it was the death of the world we had known, and we were all witnesses to the end of everything. Yet something in me, some stubborn spark of curiosity that had made me want to become a physician in the first place, whispered that perhaps endings could also be beginnings. Perhaps in understanding this death, we might discover something new about life itself. As I finished packing, I took one last look around the workshop that had been my second home. The dried herbs hanging from the rafters, the carefully labeled jars of remedies, the desk where I had spent countless hours copying Master Giovanni's notes. All of it would soon belong to the rats and the silence. But I would carry the questions with me. What was this pestilence? Where had it come from? And most importantly, how could we stop it from taking everyone we loved? The morning sun streamed through our window, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits, beautiful and peaceful, as if the world had not changed at all. But it had changed. Everything had changed, and we were about to discover just how much. The road of ghosts. The journey from Florence to Siena should have taken 2 days of comfortable travel, but the world had become a place where comfort was a luxury none could afford. Master Giovanni and I joined a ragged procession of refugees fleeing the pestilence, though none of us could say with certainty that we were not carrying death with us in our very breath. Our fellow travelers were a collection of broken humanity that would have made angels weep. There was Margherita, a baker's widow, carrying her infant son. though the child had not made a sound in hours, and his skin had taken on an unsettling greyish pallor. Behind her walked Father Tommaso, a priest whose faith seemed to shrink with every mile we travelled, muttering prayers that sounded more like arguments with God. Most disturbing was the merchant, Giuliano, whose expensive robes could not hide the telltale swellings beginning to appear at his throat. We should not travel with them, Master Giovanni whispered to me as we walked along the dusty road. The contagion spreads, and we cannot help them. But I found myself unable to abandon these people, even though every rational part of my medical training screamed that he was right. Perhaps it was foolishness, or perhaps it was the last vestige of the person I had been before the world ended. But I stayed close to Margherita and her silent child. "Tell me about your son," I said softly, hoping to distract her from the reality we all saw but refused to acknowledge. Her eyes, hollow with sleeplessness and grief, found mine. "His name is Antonio," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He is 8 months old, and he has never seen his father. My husband died of a fever last winter, before ... before all this." She gestured helplessly at the devastation around us. The road was littered with abandoned possessions, carts left when oxen died, precious family heirlooms discarded when they became too heavy to carry, children's toys dropped by small hands that would never play again. But what haunted me most were the shoes. Countless shoes of every size and style, from tiny baby slippers to heavy work boots, scattered along our path like a breadcrumb trail left by humanity's retreat. "Why are there so many shoes?" I asked Master Giovanni, though I dreaded the answer. "The feet swell," he replied grimly. "One of the first signs. People remove their shoes for relief, and then ... double quotes. He did not need to finish. Then they died, and their shoes remained as monuments to their final moments of discomfort. As the sun reached its peak, we came upon a sight that would burn itself into my memory forever. A village, I never learned its name, stood completely empty. Not abandoned, but empty in a way that suggested its inhabitants had simply vanished mid-task. A baker's oven still smouldered, filling the air with the scent of burning bread. A child's wooden top lay spinning in the dust, though no child was visible to have set it in motion. Laundry hung on lines, moving gently in the breeze like the ghosts of the people who had hung it there. "We should search for supplies," Giuliano suggested, his voice thick with the congestion that was becoming more pronounced with each hour. "We should keep moving," Father Tommaso countered, crossing himself repeatedly. "This place reeks of God's judgment." But Margherita had already wandered toward one of the houses, drawn by some desperate hope. I followed her, my physician's instincts warring with a growing sense of dread. The door stood open, creaking softly on its hinges, and inside we found a scene that explanation could not touch. A family sat around their table as if frozen in time. A man, a woman, and 3 children, all perfectly positioned as though they had been sharing a meal. But their skin was black with corruption, and the smell was beyond anything my medical training had prepared me for. Yet what disturbed me most was the food on their plates. Fresh bread, cheese that had not yet spoiled, wine that still moved liquid in their cups. "They died as they lived," I whispered, more to myself than to Margherita. Mid-bite, mid-conversation, mid-life, Margherita clutched her silent child closer to her chest. "Antonio," she whispered urgently, "Antonio, wake up, please wake up." I reached for the child, and the moment my fingers touched his cold skin, I knew what I had been refusing to acknowledge. Little Antonio had been dead for hours, perhaps since dawn, and his mother had been carrying his corpse along the road, speaking to him, caring for him, loving him as if love alone could resurrect the dead. "Margherita," I said gently, my hands trembling as I touched her shoulder. "Margherita, you must let him go." She looked at me with eyes that held no recognition, no understanding. Only the fierce, protective madness of a mother who refuses to accept the impossible. "He is sleeping," she said firmly. "He is just tired from the journey. He will wake when we reach safety. Master Giovanni appeared in the doorway, took one look at the scene, and made a decision that would haunt me for years to come. Without a word, he gently took the dead child from Margherita's arms. She fought him briefly, like a wild animal protecting her young, but exhaustion and grief had weakened her beyond resistance. When she finally released Antonio, she collapsed to her knees in the dust, and the sound she made was not quite human, part wail, part prayer, part the death song of hope itself. We buried the child in the village cemetery, among hundreds of fresh graves that had no markers, no names, no indication that the people buried there had ever lived or loved or dreamed. Father Tommaso spoke words over the small grave, but they sounded hollow, as if God had stopped listening to prayers about the pestilence weeks ago. As we prepared to leave that nameless village, Giuliano collapsed. The swellings at his throat had grown enormous, and his breathing came in wet, rattling gasps. Master Giovanni knelt beside him, but we both knew there was nothing to be done. The merchant's expensive rings gleamed on fingers that were already beginning to blacken with corruption. "Please," Giuliano whispered, grasping Master Giovanni's sleeve with surprising strength. "Do not let me die alone." So we stayed. We stayed while the sun moved across the sky, while Margherita sat motionless beside her son's grave, while Father Tommaso paced in circles, muttering increasingly incoherent prayers. We stayed and watched a man die slowly and in agony, because it was the only human thing left to do in a world that had forgotten how to be human. Giuliano died as the sun was setting, and his last words were not of God or salvation, but of his daughter in Pisa, whom he would never see again. We added another grave to the cemetery's collection, and I found myself wondering how many more graves this pestilence would require before it was satisfied. That night, we made camp in the ruins of what had once been a prosperous farmstead. The house had burned, whether by accident or design, we could not tell, but the stone walls provided some shelter from the wind that had begun to carry the first hints of winter. Father Tommaso had fallen into a fevered sleep, and I could see the telltale flush beginning to spread across his face. "We are all going to die, are we not?" I asked Master Giovanni, as we sat by our small fire. He was quiet for a long time, staring into the flames as if they held answers that his books had failed to provide. "Perhaps," he said finally, "but perhaps not. This pestilence... It is teaching us something, Caterina. Something about the nature of life and death that we never understood before. What could it possibly teach us beyond the fact that we are helpless against it? That life is not what we thought it was," he replied, his voice thoughtful. "We believed that good living, proper medicine, divine favor, that these things protected us from death. But this plague shows us that death comes regardless of virtue or sin, knowledge or ignorance, wealth or poverty. It is democratic in a way that nothing else has ever been." I considered his words as the fire crackled between us. Then what is the point of healing? What is the point of medicine if death comes anyway? Master Giovanni smiled, and for the first time in days, it was a genuine smile. "Perhaps the point is not to prevent death, but to understand life, to see it clearly, without the comfortable lies we tell ourselves. And perhaps in seeing clearly, we can discover new ways to live." As if summoned by his words, a sound drifted across the ruined landscape. Music. Somewhere in the darkness, someone was playing a lute and singing. The voice was clear and strong, untouched by the corruption that had claimed so many others, and the song was not a lament, but something almost joyful. Who would sing at a time like this? I wondered aloud. "Someone who has learned the lesson," Master Giovanni replied cryptically. "We never found the source of that music, but it followed us into our dreams. And for the first time since leaving Florence, I slept without nightmares. But when I woke, Father Tommaso was dead, his face peaceful in a way it had not been in life, and Margherita was gone, leaving only her footprints in the dust leading back toward Florence. The road to Siena stretched ahead of us, empty and uncertain, but for reasons I could not name. I felt something that might have been hope stirring in my chest. Not hope that the pestilence would end. I had seen too much to believe in such simple solutions, but hope that in understanding it, we might discover something new about what it meant to be human in a world where being human was the most dangerous thing of all. Master Giovanni gathered his books, I shouldered my satchel of herbs, and we continued our journey toward whatever waited for us in the monastery outside Siena. Behind us, the ruins of the farmstead disappeared into the morning mist, and ahead of us, the road curved away into mystery. But the singing had stopped, and once again we walked in silence through a world that death had claimed for its own. The Monastery of Questions. Brother Francesco met us at the gates of San Benedetto, as if he had been expecting us for weeks, though Master Giovanni had sent no word of our coming. The monastery stood on a hill overlooking the valley like a ship floating on a sea of olive groves. Its walls the same warm golden stone that made all of Tuscany seem blessed by perpetual sunset. But even here, in this place supposedly protected by prayers and holy purpose, I could smell the familiar sweet stench of decay carried on the autumn wind. Giovanni, Brother Francesco said, embracing my master with the easy familiarity of blood. They shared the same sharp features and intelligent eyes, though the monk's face held a serenity that his physician brother had lost somewhere on the road from Florence. "You look terrible." "Thank you for that observation," Master Giovanni replied dryly. "I feel worse than I look, which should concern us both considerably." Brother Francesco led us through courtyards where monks moved silently about their work, tending gardens that seemed absurdly lush given the death that surrounded us. The vegetables grew fat and healthy, the fruit trees hung heavy with harvest, and the herb gardens released fragrances so pure and strong they made my eyes water. It was as if the monastery existed in a different world entirely, one where the pestilence was merely a rumor from distant lands. "How many have you lost?" Master Giovanni asked as we walked. 17, Brother Francesco replied simply. "Of 43 brothers. But that was in the early days, when we still believed that prayer alone would protect us. And now," the monk smiled, and there was something almost mischievous in his expression. "Now we pray and wash our hands. We pray and boil our water. We pray and isolate the sick. We pray and observe. God helps those who help themselves, does he not?" We were given a small cell in the guest quarters, clean and sparse, with 2 narrow beds and a window that looked out over the valley. From there I could see the road we had travelled, winding through landscape that looked peaceful from this distance. But I knew what horrors that road had shown us, and I wondered how many other travellers were making their way along it at this very moment, carrying death or fleeing from it, or both. "Rest," Brother Francesco instructed us. "Tonight you will join us for Vespers, and afterward you will meet someone who has been asking very interesting questions about our current ... situation." That evening, I sat in the monastery chapel as the monks chanted their evening prayers, the Latin words echoing off stone walls in harmonies that seemed to lift the very air. The sound was beautiful and comforting, but my mind kept wandering to all the churches in Florence that now stood empty, their priests dead or fled, their congregations scattered to the winds. Had God abandoned those places? Or had he simply moved his presence here, to this hilltop sanctuary where men still believed that order could triumph over chaos? After the service, Brother Francesco led us to a small room where a figure sat hunched over a table covered with papers, charts, and what looked like detailed drawings of human anatomy. When the person looked up, I gasped in surprise. It was a woman, perhaps 30 years old, with ink-stained fingers and eyes that burned with an intensity I had seen only in Master Giovanni's face when he was pursuing a particularly elusive diagnosis. "This is Sister Agatha," Brother Francesco said, seeming to enjoy our shocked expressions. "She has been researching our current difficulties with methods that some might consider unconventional." Sister Agatha rose and extended her hand to Master Giovanni in a gesture that was startlingly modern and confident. "I have read your treatise on the balance of humors," she said. "Brilliant work, though I believe your conclusions about bloodletting may need revision in light of recent observations." Master Giovanni shook her hand, his face a mixture of admiration and bewilderment. "You are a physician. I am a student of creation," she replied. "My father was a physician in Padua before the pestilence claimed him. He taught me to read Latin and Greek, to understand the human body, to ask questions that others consider inappropriate for women to ask. When the plague reached our city, I came here seeking answers, and Brother Francesco has been kind enough to provide me with subjects for study." "Subjects?" I asked, though I suspected I knew what she meant. Sister Agatha gestured to her papers, and I saw that they were covered with detailed drawings of human bodies. Anatomical studies, more precise than anything I had seen in Master Giovanni's texts. But these bodies were marked with the characteristic swellings and blackened flesh of plague victims. "I have been documenting the progression of the disease," she explained, "how it enters the body, how it spreads, how it kills. The knowledge may come too late to save those already afflicted, but perhaps it will help us understand what we are truly facing." Master Giovanni leaned over her drawings, his expression growing more animated than I had seen it since we left Florence. "These swellings, you believe they are connected to the bodily humors?" "I believe they are something else entirely," Sister Agatha replied, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Something that challenges everything we think we know about disease and healing." She led us to another table where she had arranged a collection of what I initially took to be medical instruments, but soon realized was something far more unusual. There were tiny lenses that magnified objects beyond normal sight, delicate scales for weighing substances too small to measure by conventional means, and glass containers filled with liquids in colors I had never seen. "Where did you obtain these?" Master Giovanni asked, picking up one of the lenses with trembling fingers. "My father corresponded with scholars in Constantinople before the city fell to the Turks," Sister Agatha explained. "They had preserved knowledge from the ancient Greeks that we in the West had lost or forgotten. These instruments, they allow us to see things that are invisible to the naked eye." She took the lens from Master Giovanni and held it over a small glass slide. "Look," she commanded, adjusting the position until something came into focus. What I saw through that lens changed everything I thought I knew about the nature of disease. The liquid on the slide was not uniform, as it appeared to the naked eye, but was teeming with tiny moving shapes, creatures so small they were like living dust, swimming and writhing in patterns that seemed almost purposeful. "What are they?" I whispered, afraid to speak too loudly, as if these invisible creatures might hear me. "I do not know," Sister Agatha admitted, "but I have found them in the blood of every plague victim I have examined. They are not present in healthy individuals, but they appear in the afflicted within hours of the first symptoms." Master Giovanni was staring through the lens with an expression of wonder and horror. "You are saying that the pestilence is caused by living creatures, creatures too small to see?" "I am saying that is what the evidence suggests," Sister Agatha replied carefully, "though such a conclusion challenges every medical text ever written." Brother Francesco, who had been listening in silence, finally spoke. "Sister Agatha has also been studying the patterns of infection. She believes she has identified how the disease spreads." Sister Agatha moved to a large map of Italy that was covered with marks and notations. "The pestilence follows trade routes," she explained. "It spreads from port to port, city to city, along the paths that merchants and travelers take. But within cities, it shows a distinct pattern. It affects those who live in crowded, filthy conditions more severely than those who live in cleaner environments. The poor die faster than the rich," I observed, thinking of the neighborhoods in Florence where entire families had been wiped out, while some wealthy households remained untouched. "Exactly, and I believe this is connected to the invisible creatures I showed you. They thrive in filth and decay, multiply in conditions where human waste and animal refuse are allowed to accumulate. Master Giovanni was pacing now, his mind working at a pace I had not seen since before the plague began. If this is true, if disease is caused by living creatures, rather than imbalanced humors, then everything we have believed about medicine is wrong. Not wrong, Sister Agatha corrected gently. Incomplete. We have been treating symptoms while ignoring causes. We have been looking at the forest while missing the trees. As if to underscore her point, the chapel bells began to toll, but not in their usual pattern for night prayers. This was the death knell, slow and mournful, announcing that another member of the community had succumbed to the pestilence. Brother Marcus, Brother Francesco said quietly, recognizing the pattern of tolls. He was tending the sick in the village below. A good man, but perhaps too trusting in divine protection. Or perhaps, Sister Agatha added with something that might have been gentle irony, too untrusting in the value of washing his hands. That night, I lay on my narrow bed, listening to the sounds of the monastery at rest, the whisper of sandaled feet on stone floors, the distant murmur of prayers, the scratch of pen on parchment from the cell, where Sister Agatha continued her work by candlelight. Through the window, I could see stars scattered across the sky like scattered diamonds, beautiful and distant and utterly indifferent to the suffering below. But, for the first time since the pestilence began, I felt something that was more than mere hope. I felt the stirring of understanding, the sense that we were standing at the edge of knowledge that could change not just how we treated disease, but how we understood the very nature of life and death. Master Giovanni was awake too. I could tell from his breathing. "Caterina," he said softly, "what do you think of what we learned tonight?" "I think," I replied carefully, "that Sister Agatha may be seeing the future." "And what kind of future is that?" I considered his question as an owl called somewhere in the darkness beyond our window. A future where physicians heal not just symptoms but causes, where we understand that the human body is not separate from the world around it, but connected to everything, to the air we breathe, the water we drink, the invisible creatures that share our world. A dangerous future, Master Giovanni observed. Knowledge like this could be seen as heretical. The Church teaches that disease is divine punishment for sin, not the result of invisible creatures. Then perhaps, I said, surprising myself with my boldness, the Church needs new teachers. The next morning brought news that would change the course of our lives forever. A messenger arrived at dawn, exhausted and wild-eyed, carrying word from Florence that made Brother Francesco pale as he read it aloud. The city had fallen completely to the pestilence. The government had collapsed, the churches were empty, and those few survivors who remained were fighting over the ruins like scavengers. But most shocking of all, groups of flagellants had taken control of several districts, declaring that only through mass self-punishment could the city be purified and God's wrath turned aside. "They are burning books," the messenger reported, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and horror. "Any text that deals with medicine or natural philosophy. They say such knowledge is what brought God's curse upon us." Master Giovanni's face went white. "My library," he whispered. 20 years of collected knowledge. Gone, the messenger confirmed, along with every other physician's collection in the city. "They say they will burn anyone found practicing the healing arts without authorization from their religious leaders." Sister Agatha had joined us to listen to this news, and her expression was grim. "They are destroying the very knowledge that might save them," she said. "Fear has made them choose ignorance over understanding. Then we must preserve what we can hear," Brother Francesco declared, his voice carrying an authority I had not heard before. "We must continue the work, in secret if necessary, until the madness passes." As the messenger departed to carry his terrible news to other cities, I realized that we had witnessed more than the fall of Florence. We had witnessed the moment when knowledge itself became dangerous, when the pursuit of truth became an act of rebellion against the established order. But Sister Agatha was already returning to her microscopes, and her anatomical drawings. Master Giovanni was reaching for his medical texts, and Brother Francesco was quietly organizing the monastery's resources to support their work. The pestilence had taken our city, our security, and our certainties about the nature of the world. But it had also given us something unexpected, the freedom to ask new questions, to challenge old assumptions, to seek truth wherever it might lead us. And as I picked up my pen to begin recording our observations, I knew that whatever emerged from this darkness, it would be something entirely new, something that would reshape not just medicine, but humanity's understanding of its place in the vast, invisible, interconnected web of life. The future was being born in that monastery cell, one careful observation at a time. The heretic's laboratory. Winter arrived early that year, as if the world itself had grown tired of warmth and light. Snow fell on the monastery with unusual persistence, sealing us away from the outside world like insects preserved in amber. But this isolation, which might have driven others to despair, became our greatest blessing. While flagellants burned libraries in Florence and princes fled their kingdoms, we three, Master Giovanni, Sister Agatha, and I, worked in secret to unlock the mysteries that the pestilence had revealed. Sister Agatha had transformed the monastery's old wine cellar into something that would have scandalized the church authorities had they known of its existence. Ancient wine barrels now held carefully preserved specimens, their wooden sides marked with Latin labels describing contents that would have made inquisitors reach for their torches. Glass vessels filled with mysterious liquids lined stone shelves, and her collection of lenses and measuring instruments had grown as more packages arrived from her mysterious correspondence in distant lands. Today, she announced as I descended the narrow stairs that morning, we are going to perform an act that will either advance human knowledge by centuries or condemn our souls to eternal damnation. She spoke with such casual cheerfulness that it took me a moment to process the magnitude of what she was suggesting. Master Giovanni, who was carefully adjusting one of her strange instruments, looked up with eyebrows raised. I assume you mean the dissection, he said, his voice carefully neutral. Sister Agatha nodded, gesturing toward a table in the center of the room where a shape lay covered by white cloth. Brother Thomas died 3 days ago, and he specifically requested that his body be used to advance our understanding of the pestilence. He was ... curious about our work. I approached the table with steps that felt heavier than lead. The Church's prohibition against dissection of human bodies was absolute. Such practices were considered defilement of God's creation, a violation so severe that it could result in excommunication or worse. Yet here we were, about to cut open a man who had been sharing meals with us just days before. Brother Francesco approved this, I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. Brother Francesco, Sister Agatha replied with a slight smile, has developed a remarkable talent for being elsewhere when certain activities take place in his monastery. She pulled back the cloth, revealing Brother Thomas's body with a reverence that somehow made the act feel sacred rather than sacrilegious. The monk had been a small man in life, scholarly and gentle, with hands permanently stained by ink from his work copying manuscripts. In death, the pestilence had marked him with its familiar signs, the dark swellings, the blackened fingertips, the expression of final agony that no amount of peaceful arrangement could entirely erase. What exactly are we looking for? Master Giovanni asked, though his hands were already reaching for the instruments Sister Agatha had prepared. Understanding, she replied simply, the invisible creatures I showed you through the lens, I believe, they concentrate in certain organs. If we can map their presence, we might discover not just how the pestilence kills, but how it spreads through the body. What followed was the most extraordinary morning of my life. As Master Giovanni and Sister Agatha made their careful incisions, I recorded everything, the color and texture of organs, the presence or absence of the telltale swellings, the way different parts of the body had been affected by the disease. But what emerged was not just anatomical knowledge, but something far more profound. "Look at this," Sister Agatha whispered, holding up a small section of lung tissue for examination under her most powerful lens. "The creatures are not randomly distributed. They cluster around specific structures, almost as if they are following paths through the body." Master Giovanni peered through the lens, his expression growing more amazed with each observation. "They follow the blood vessels," he said slowly, "and the pathways of air through the lungs. It is as if they understand the body better than we do." "Not understand," Sister Agatha corrected, "but they have evolved to exploit the body's own systems. They use our blood to travel, our breath to spread, our waste to multiply." As the day progressed, our discoveries multiplied. We found that the invisible creatures were present in different concentrations in different organs, that they seemed to prefer certain types of tissue over others, and most remarkably, that they appeared to change their behavior based on their location in the body. "This changes everything," Master Giovanni said as we finally covered Brother Thomas's body with clean cloth, our examination complete. "If disease is caused by living creatures that can be observed and studied, then medicine becomes a science rather than an art based on ancient authorities. More than that," Sister Agatha added, carefully cleaning her instruments with a thoroughness that now made perfect sense given what we had learned. "If we can understand how these creatures live and multiply, we might discover ways to destroy them." That evening, as snow continued to fall outside our underground laboratory, we made our first breakthrough. Sister Agatha had been experimenting with various substances, testing their effects on samples of infected blood viewed through her lenses. Most had no effect. The invisible creatures continued their frantic, swimming regardless of what she added to their liquid environment. But when she added a few drops of a clear liquid distilled from wine, something remarkable happened. "They are slowing down," she whispered, her eye pressed to the lens. "Giovanni, Caterina, come see this." Under the magnified view, the tiny creatures that had been moving with purposeful energy were now moving sluggishly, like swimmers fighting against thick honey. As we watched, more of them stopped moving entirely, drifting motionless in the liquid like fallen leaves. "What did you add?" Master Giovanni asked, his voice tight with excitement. "Aquavita," Sister Agatha replied, using the alchemical term for distilled alcohol, but purified beyond anything the winemakers produce. "I have been experimenting with distillation techniques described in Arabic texts." "You killed them," I said, hardly believing what I was seeing. "You actually killed the creatures that caused the pestilence." Sister Agatha's hands were trembling as she prepared another slide. "If this works consistently, if we can reproduce this effect, ... double quotes. She did not need to finish the sentence. We all understood the implications. We worked through the night, testing different concentrations, different methods of application, different samples of infected material. By dawn, we had confirmed what seemed impossible. A substance existed that could destroy the invisible creatures responsible for the Black Death. But as the first light of morning filtered through the high windows of our laboratory, Brother Francesco appeared at the top of the stairs, his face grave with news that shattered our moment of triumph. "You must destroy everything," he said without preamble. "The papal legate is coming, and he brings with him investigators whose purpose is to root out heretical practices." When Master Giovanni asked, though he was already beginning to gather Sister Agatha's precious instruments, 3 days, perhaps 4 if the snow delays them. They have heard rumors of unnatural studies being conducted in monasteries, of women practicing medicine, of dissections being performed. They come with authority to examine every cell, every manuscript, every suspicious activity. Sister Agatha was carefully wrapping her lenses in soft cloth, her movements precise despite the urgency of the situation. "The knowledge cannot be lost," she said firmly. "Too many have died for us to simply abandon what we have learned." "Then we must preserve it in a way that survives the Inquisition," I said, surprised by my own boldness. "We must encode it, hide it, Ensure that future scholars can rediscover what we have found." Brother Francesco smiled grimly. "I had hoped you would say that. There is a place, a cave system, in the hills above the monastery. Hermits used it for centuries before we arrived. If you are willing to live in isolation, to continue your work in conditions that would challenge the hardiest monk." "Yes," Sister Agatha said, without hesitation. "We will do whatever is necessary." As we packed our essential materials and prepared to abandon the safety of the monastery for the uncertainty of life as fugitives, I realized that we had crossed a line from which there could be no return. We were no longer simply physicians seeking to heal the sick. We had become something new: researchers, scientists, rebels against the established order of the world. The snow continued to fall as we made our preparations, each flake a small symbol of the cold isolation that awaited us. But in the carefully wrapped packages of instruments, in the encoded notes that Sister Agatha was preparing, in the vials of purified aqua vita that might hold the key to defeating the pestilence, I saw something that burned brighter than any fire. I saw the future of human knowledge, fragile and precious, being passed from our hands to whoever would be brave enough to continue the work we had begun. 3 days later, when the papal investigators arrived at the monastery of San Benedetto, they found nothing more suspicious than monks going about their traditional duties of prayer, copying manuscripts and tending gardens. The wine cellar held only wine. The library contained only approved texts, and the guest quarters showed no sign of the revolutionary discoveries that had been made there. But in the hills above, in a cave that had sheltered seekers of truth for 1,000 years, 3 figures bent over instruments that could reveal the invisible world, pursuing knowledge that would one day save millions of lives. The persecution had only made us stronger, and the isolation had only made our purpose clearer. We were the guardians of a truth too important to be destroyed by fear, too valuable to be abandoned to ignorance. And in the depths of winter, in the depths of a cave, in the depths of a world consumed by plague and madness, the first flames of the Renaissance were being kindled by hands that refused to let the light of knowledge be extinguished. The Cave of Wonders. Living in a cave sounds romantic when troubadours sing about hermits and holy contemplation, but the reality involves a great deal more dampness and significantly fewer moments of divine inspiration than the songs suggest. Our refuge was a complex of limestone chambers that had been carved by water over countless centuries, creating spaces that were sometimes cathedral vast and sometimes barely wide enough for a single person to squeeze through. Sister Agatha had claimed the largest chamber for our laboratory, and within weeks had transformed it into something that would have seemed magical to anyone who stumbled upon it. Crystals that grew naturally from the cave walls reflected and amplified the light from our carefully hoarded candles, creating an environment where her delicate instruments could function despite our primitive conditions. Stone shelves held our preserved specimens, and a natural pool of pure spring water provided the clean conditions necessary for our observations. "We are probably the only people in Europe," she observed one morning as she adjusted her most powerful lens, "who are living better during the pestilence than we did before it began." It was a strange truth. While cities burned and populations fled in terror, we 3 had found a peace and purpose that felt almost supernatural. Our days followed a rhythm of discovery that made time itself seem different. Mornings spent observing specimens, afternoons recording our findings, evenings discussing implications that grew more profound with each passing week. Master Giovanni had thrown himself into the work with an enthusiasm that made him seem years younger. The theoretical physician had become a practical researcher, and his careful methodology complemented Sister Agatha's intuitive brilliance perfectly. As for me, I found myself becoming something that had no name in our world, neither physician, nor monk, nor scholar, but some new creature shaped by the unique circumstances of our exile. "Caterina," Sister Agatha called from her position at the microscope, "you must see this immediately." I hurried to her side, expecting another observation about the behavior of the pestilence creatures. Instead, what I saw through the lens was something entirely different. A drop of my own blood, taken from a small cut on my finger, teeming with activity that had nothing to do with disease. "What am I looking at?" I asked, though part of me already suspected the answer. "Life," she said simply. "Your blood is not a simple liquid, as we have always believed. It is a universe of tiny creatures, different from the pestilence organisms, but clearly alive and purposeful." Master Giovanni joined us at the lens, and his sharp intake of breath confirmed what I was seeing. "They look almost like soldiers," he said slowly, "as if they are organized for some purpose." Sister Agatha nodded enthusiastically. "I believe they are defending your body against invasion. Watch what happens when I add some of the pestilence creatures to this sample." What followed was nothing less than microscopic warfare. The tiny defenders in my blood immediately surrounded the pestilence invaders, attacking them with a coordination that suggested intelligence, or at least purpose beyond mere chance. Some of the defenders died in the process, but others seemed to learn from the encounter, becoming more effective with each engagement. "This is why some people survive the pestilence while others die," Sister Agatha said, her voice filled with wonder. "Their defending creatures are stronger or more numerous or better adapted to fight the invasion. Then the human body is not passive in disease." Master Giovanni added, his medical training struggling to accommodate this revolutionary concept. "It fights back." "More than that," I said, suddenly understanding something that had been puzzling us for months. "This is why children and elderly people die more often than healthy adults. Their defending creatures are either not fully developed or have become weakened with age." Over the following weeks, this discovery opened new avenues of investigation that kept us working by candlelight long into each night. We found that different people had different types and numbers of defending creatures in their blood. We discovered that certain foods seemed to strengthen these defenders, while others appeared to weaken them. Most importantly, we learned that exposure to small amounts of various diseases seemed to train the defending creatures to fight more effectively. "It is as if the body remembers its battles," Sister Agatha observed as she documented our findings in her careful script. "Each encounter with disease teaches it something that helps it fight future battles." This insight led us to our most dangerous experiment yet. Using her distillation techniques, Sister Agatha had created increasingly pure forms of aquavita, some so concentrated that they could dissolve metal. But she had also discovered that certain plants, when properly prepared, produced substances that seemed to strengthen the body's defending creatures without causing the harm that came with the purified alcohol. If we could create a preparation that both kills pestilence creatures and strengthens defenders, she hypothesized, we might have a true cure rather than just a treatment. The work was painstaking and often frustrating. Many combinations killed both invaders and defenders indiscriminately. Others had no effect at all. But gradually, through trial and error, guided by careful observation, we began to develop mixtures that showed promise. It was during this period that we received our first visitor. Brother Francesco appeared at the cave entrance one snowy evening, carrying news from the outside world that made us realize how isolated we had become. "The pestilence is ending," he announced without preamble. "Not because we have defeated it, but because it has run out of victims." The silence that followed his words was profound. We had been so focused on understanding the disease that we had lost track of its progress through the world beyond our cave. "What do you mean?" Master Giovanni asked finally. "Cities that were populated by hundreds of thousands now hold only tens of thousands," Brother Francesco explained, settling gratefully by our fire. "Entire regions have been depopulated. The pestilence is not disappearing because we have conquered it, but because there are no longer enough people living close together for it to spread effectively." Sister Agatha was staring into the fire, her mind clearly working through the implications. "Then, what we are learning here may be too late to help those who are dying now," but it could prevent future outbreaks. More than that, I added, understanding dawning on me. If the population has been reduced so dramatically, everything about how society works will have to change. Brother Francesco nodded grimly. The old order is collapsing. Feudal lords have no serfs to work their land. Cities have no craftsmen to maintain their industries. The church has lost so many priests that entire dioceses are without leadership. And yet, Master Giovanni observed thoughtfully, this creates opportunities. If the old authorities are weakened, perhaps new ideas can take root. That, Brother Francesco said with a meaningful look at our laboratory setup, is exactly what I came to discuss. What he told us next changed everything. Scattered throughout Europe, other scholars were emerging from their own hiding places, carrying knowledge that had been preserved despite the chaos. Some had maintained correspondence through networks of merchants and travelers. Others had independently made discoveries similar to ours. A few had even managed to establish small centers of learning in places where the old restrictions had broken down completely. There is talk, Brother Francesco said carefully, of establishing a new kind of school, not bound by traditional authorities, but dedicated to understanding the natural world through direct observation and experimentation. Where? Sister Agatha asked, her eyes bright with interest. Padua, perhaps. Or Bologna, cities where the merchant classes have gained power and are less concerned with traditional religious restrictions than with practical knowledge that can help them rebuild their prosperity. As we discussed this possibility, I realized that we were not just talking about preserving our specific discoveries about the pestilence. We were talking about creating an entirely new approach to understanding the world, one based on careful observation rather than ancient authorities, on experimentation rather than pure theory, on evidence rather than faith alone. We would be leaving this sanctuary, Master Giovanni pointed out, exposing ourselves to the dangers and uncertainties of the world beyond these walls. But we would also be sharing what we have learned, I replied, and learning from others who have been asking similar questions. Sister Agatha was already packing her most essential instruments. The knowledge belongs to humanity, not to us alone, she said firmly. We have a responsibility to ensure that what we have discovered here can be used to prevent future suffering. As spring arrived in the hills above the monastery, we prepared for another journey. But this time, we traveled not as refugees fleeing from destruction, but as pioneers carrying the seeds of a new age of human understanding. The cave that had sheltered us through the darkest winter in human memory would remain, its walls still glowing with reflected candlelight, its pools still pure and clear. But the knowledge we had created there would travel with us into a world that was ready, perhaps for the first time in centuries, to embrace new ways of seeing and understanding the mysteries of life and death. The pestilence had taken almost everything from humanity, our cities, our certainties, our faith in the old ways of doing things. But in return, it had given us something precious beyond measure, the freedom to ask new questions and the courage to seek answers wherever they might lead us. We emerged from our cave into a spring morning bright with possibility, carrying instruments that could reveal the invisible world and ideas that could reshape the visible one. Behind us lay the winter of humanity's greatest catastrophe. Ahead of us stretched the dawn of the Renaissance, the new dawn. The University of Padua in the spring of 1352 was a place where the impossible had become commonplace. Students who would have been forbidden from certain studies just 5 years earlier now gathered openly to discuss theories that would have scandalized their professors. Women attended lectures alongside men, Jews debated with Christians, and the careful boundaries that had once separated acceptable knowledge from dangerous inquiry had dissolved like morning mist. Sister Agatha, who had abandoned her religious title in favor of the simple name Agatha of Tuscany, stood before a gathering of Europe's most brilliant surviving scholars, demonstrating the use of her microscopic lenses with the confidence of someone who had looked death in the eye and learned its secrets. Master Giovanni sat in the front row, no longer my teacher but my colleague, taking notes as enthusiastically as the youngest student present. "What you are seeing," Agatha explained as she adjusted the instrument for another observer, "challenges the fundamental assumptions upon which all medical practice has been based. Disease is not an imbalance of humors or a punishment from God, but an invasion by living creatures too small to see without magnification." The man peering through the lens was Dr. Andreas Vesalius, a Flemish anatomist whose own work on human dissection had made him famous throughout the scholarly world. His sharp intake of breath told us that he understood the significance of what he was observing. "Remarkable," he murmured, stepping back from the instrument. "If this is true, and the evidence is compelling, then we must reconsider everything we believe about the nature of life itself." The audience erupted in discussion, voices rising as decades of accepted wisdom were challenged in a single moment. But what struck me most was not the excitement or even the skepticism, but the freedom with which these scholars could express their ideas. The Black Death had shattered so many institutions that new ones were being built on entirely different foundations. "Katerina," called a voice from the back of the room, "tell us about your observations of the body's defending mechanisms." I rose to address the assembly, still marveling at the fact that my words would be taken seriously by these distinguished men. 3 years earlier, I had been an apprentice whose primary duty was to organize herbs and copy texts. Now I was presenting original research to some of the finest minds in Europe. "We have discovered that the human body is not passive in disease," I began, my voice growing stronger as I spoke. "Within our blood live countless tiny warriors whose purpose is to protect us from invasion. The pestilence succeeds when it overwhelms these defenders, but fails when they are strong enough to resist." Dr. Vesalius leaned forward with interest. "And you believe these defenders can be strengthened?" "We have developed preparations that appear to enhance their effectiveness," I replied, gesturing to the carefully labeled vials that represented months of experimentation in our cave laboratory. Certain plant extracts, properly distilled, seemed to invigorate the body's natural protective mechanisms. What followed was the most intellectually stimulating afternoon of my entire life. Scholars from across Europe shared discoveries they had made in isolation, creating connections between observations that none of us could have developed alone. A physician from Prague had noticed that certain occupations seemed to provide protection against the pestilence. An alchemist from Oxford had developed new techniques for purifying substances that might have medical applications. A natural philosopher from Paris had been studying the spread of disease through populations and had identified patterns that matched our microscopic observations perfectly. "We are witnessing the birth of a new natural philosophy," declared Master Giovanni as the formal session concluded, "one based not on ancient authorities, but on direct observation and experimentation." Dr. Vesalius nodded enthusiastically. "We must document everything, preserve every discovery, ensure that this knowledge cannot be lost to future persecution or catastrophe." "More than that," Agatha added, her eyes bright with possibility, "we must train others. The knowledge is too important to remain in the hands of a few scholars. We need to create a new generation of practitioners who understand these principles." This conversation led to the founding of what we initially called simply the Society, a network of scholars, physicians, and natural philosophers dedicated to advancing human knowledge through systematic observation and experimentation. Within months, similar groups had formed in other cities throughout Europe, all connected by correspondence and shared purpose. But our greatest achievement was something none of us had anticipated when we first descended into that cave above the monastery. By the autumn of 1352, we had developed the first effective treatment for plague that actually worked by addressing the cause rather than merely the symptoms. The breakthrough came when Agatha discovered that a particular combination of distilled plant essences not only killed pestilence creatures, but seemed to strengthen the body's defenders against future infection. When tested on volunteers who had been exposed to the disease, The treatment reduced mortality from the typical 80% to less than 20%. "We have done it," Master Giovanni said simply as we reviewed the results of our trials. "We have found a way to defeat the Black Death." But even as we celebrated this triumph, news arrived that put our achievement in sobering perspective. The pestilence was indeed ending, but not because of any human intervention. It was ending because it had accomplished something unprecedented in recorded history. It had fundamentally altered the structure of European society. The messenger who brought us this news was a young merchant named Lorenzo, whose family had been traders before the plague, and were now among the few with the resources and connections to re-establish commerce between surviving cities. "Entire kingdoms have vanished," he reported, his voice still carrying the shock of someone who had traveled through landscapes of abandonment. "England has lost half its population. France is barely functional as a nation. The Holy Roman Empire exists only in name. And the common people?" I asked, thinking of the families I had known in Florence. "Those who survived find themselves in a world transformed," Lorenzo replied. "Serfs who never owned so much as the clothes on their backs now inherit entire farms abandoned by dead masters. Craftsmen who once competed desperately for work now command wages that would have seemed impossible just a few years ago." Agatha was studying a map of Europe, marking the locations where we knew the population had been most severely affected. "The social structure that existed for centuries has been completely disrupted," she observed. "When we emerge from this scholarly refuge, we will be entering a world that operates by entirely different rules." This realization led to the most important decision of our lives. We could remain in Padua, pursuing our research in the safety of academic isolation, or we could return to the devastated world beyond the university walls and apply what we had learned to help rebuild civilization on new foundations. The knowledge we have gained means nothing if it remains locked away in scholarly debates. I argued during one of our evening discussions, we have learned not just how to treat disease, but how to observe, how to experiment, how to question assumptions that were once considered unshakable. These methods could transform not just medicine, but every aspect of human knowledge. Master Giovanni smiled at my passion, but his expression was thoughtful. "You are proposing that we become teachers, not just to other scholars, but to anyone willing to learn these new ways of understanding the world." "Exactly," Agatha agreed. "The old authorities have been weakened or destroyed. This creates an opportunity to spread knowledge that was once restricted to a privileged few." As winter approached Padua, we made our decision. We would spend one more season documenting our discoveries and training others in our methods. But when spring came, we would venture out into the transformed world as ambassadors of a new age of human understanding. The final evening of our time at the university, I stood on the balcony of our lodgings, looking out over a city that bustled with activity despite the devastation that surrounded it. Students hurried between lectures. Merchants negotiated deals that would have been impossible under the old economic system, and scholars from different nations worked together on projects that transcended the political boundaries that had once seemed so important. "What are you thinking?" Agatha asked, joining me in the cool evening air. "I am thinking that we lived through the end of the world," I replied, "and discovered that endings can also be beginnings." She nodded, understanding exactly what I meant. The pestilence took everything we thought we knew about how life should be lived, but it also freed us to imagine new possibilities. As the stars emerged in the darkening sky, I realized that we had indeed witnessed something unprecedented in human history. Not just a plague that killed millions, but a transformation so complete that it had created space for entirely new ways of thinking about humanity's relationship with the natural world. Tomorrow, we would begin our journey back into that transformed world, carrying with us not just knowledge of how to treat disease, but a new approach to understanding reality itself, one based on careful observation, systematic experimentation, and the revolutionary idea that human beings could uncover the secrets of creation through their own efforts. The Renaissance was beginning, and we had been present at its birth. Epilogue. The Legacy of Questions, Florence. Autumn 1367 to 15 years after I first fled its plague-ravaged streets as a terrified apprentice, I returned to my birthplace as Dr. Caterina Rossi, the first woman to hold a formal medical degree from the University of Padua, carrying a leather satchel filled with instruments that could reveal the invisible world, and a head filled with knowledge that had been purchased with the lives of half of Europe. The city I found bore little resemblance to the Florence of my youth, where once narrow, filthy streets had bred disease and despair. Broad avenues now allowed light and air to circulate freely. The surviving population had used their newfound wealth and freedom to completely reimagine how a city should function. Public fountains provided clean water, waste removal systems kept streets sanitary, and new laws required that buildings be constructed with windows large enough to admit healing sunlight. But the most remarkable change was not physical but intellectual. Throughout the city, I found workshops where craftsmen and scholars worked side by side, applying the principles of careful observation and systematic experimentation to everything from metallurgy to agriculture. The rigid separation between theoretical knowledge and practical application had dissolved, replaced by a new understanding that wisdom came from combining thought with action. My first visit was to the site where our old house had stood. The building was gone, replaced by a small hospital that served the surrounding district. Above its entrance, carved in stone, were words that made my heart leap with recognition: observe, question, test, heal. Dr. Rossi, a young voice called from behind me. I turned to see a girl of perhaps 16, clearly an apprentice from her simple dress and the medical texts tucked under her arm. But she stood with a confidence that would have been impossible for a woman of her age in the world I remembered. I am Maria Benedetti, she continued, apprentice physician to Master Alfonso. He trained under Master Giovanni before his death last year. I have read your treatise on microscopic life, and I wondered, would you be willing to examine some specimens I have prepared? As I followed this eager young scholar to her makeshift laboratory, I marveled at how naturally she assumed that her questions would be taken seriously, that her observations would be valued, that her gender would not prevent her from pursuing the highest levels of learning available to humanity. Her laboratory was a miracle of innovation and determination. Unable to afford the expensive lenses that Agatha and I had used, Maria had learned to grind her own glass, creating instruments that were crude but functional. Her specimens were carefully preserved, her notes meticulously recorded, and her questions showed a sophistication that reminded me of my own intellectual awakening in that cave so many years ago. I have been studying the creatures that cause different diseases, she explained, adjusting her homemade microscope with practiced skill. I believe each type of illness is caused by different invisible life forms, and that understanding their specific behaviors could lead to more targeted treatments. As I peered through her lens at specimens that confirmed her hypothesis, I realized that the future I had dreamed of during those dark days of the pestilence had not just arrived. It had exceeded my wildest expectations. Knowledge that had once been the exclusive province of a few privileged scholars was now being pursued by anyone with curiosity and determination. Later that day, I visited the new University of Florence, established in a palace that had once belonged to a feudal lord who died without heirs. The great halls that had once echoed with the empty ceremonies of aristocratic privilege now hummed with the sound of genuine learning. Students from every social class sat together, pursuing studies that ranged from the traditional liberal arts to entirely new disciplines that had no ancient precedents. In the medical faculty, I found Agatha, now Professor Agatha of Tuscany, teaching a class of aspiring physicians who hung on her every word as she demonstrated the use of microscopic observation in diagnosis. Her hair was silver now, and her face bore the lines of someone who had spent years peering through lenses at the hidden structures of life. but her eyes still burned with the same intellectual fire that had driven her to challenge centuries of medical dogma. "Katerina," she exclaimed when she noticed me in the back of her lecture hall, "students, you have the honor of meeting one of the pioneers of modern medicine, Dr. Rossi was instrumental in developing our understanding of the body's natural defense mechanisms." After her lecture, we walked together through gardens where medical students grew and studied the plants that provided the raw materials for their medicines. The integration of practical knowledge with theoretical understanding had created an approach to education that was producing physicians far more capable than any the world had ever known. "Do you ever regret it?" Agatha asked as we sat by a fountain designed according to principles of hydraulic engineering that had been rediscovered through systematic experimentation, giving up the simple certainties of the old world for all this complexity. I considered her question as I watched students discussing their observations with a freedom and intensity that would have seemed impossible during my own youth. "How can I regret discoveries that have saved so many lives and opened so many minds? But the cost," she persisted. "We lost so much, so many people, so many achievements of the past, so much that was beautiful and meaningful in the old ways." It was true. The Black Death had taken treasures that could never be recovered, art, music, literature, and entire ways of life that had developed over centuries. The grief for that loss would always be part of who we were. "Perhaps," I said finally, "the cost was so high because the changes needed to be so fundamental. Perhaps humanity needed to lose almost everything in order to find the courage to rebuild from first principles." As evening approached, I made my way to the hill where the monastery of San Benedetto still stood, though it too had been transformed by the years. Brother Francesco, now an elderly abbot, welcomed me with the same gentle wisdom he had shown during our darkest days. "The cave is still there," he told me as we walked through cloisters where monks now copied not just religious texts, but scientific treatises from across the known world. "Sometimes I think pilgrims should visit it as a shrine to human curiosity." That night, I climbed the familiar path to our old refuge, carrying a lantern to light the way. The cave was exactly as we had left it, the natural crystal formations still gleaming, the pool of spring water still pure and clear, the stone shelves still bearing the marks where our instruments had rested. But it was no longer a place of desperate isolation. It had become something else, a symbol of the moment when human beings decided to trust their own observations more than ancient authorities, to ask new questions rather than simply repeat old answers, to seek truth wherever it might lead them, regardless of how uncomfortable or challenging that truth might be. As I sat in the silence of that sacred space, I thought about all the lives that had been saved by the medicines we had developed, all the diseases that had been conquered by physicians trained in our methods, all the minds that had been freed to explore questions that previous generations had never dared to ask. But most of all, I thought about Maria Benedetti and the countless other young scholars like her, people who had grown up in a world where curiosity was celebrated rather than feared, where questions were welcomed rather than suppressed, where the pursuit of knowledge was seen not as a challenge to divine authority, but as a form of worship that honored creation by seeking to understand it. The Black Death had been the end of one world and the beginning of another. It had taken our certainties and given us questions. It had taken our security and given us freedom. It had taken our past and given us a future that we could shape with our own hands and minds. As I prepared to leave the cave for what I knew would be the last time, I realized that we had accomplished something far more important than simply surviving a plague or developing new medicines. We had participated in the most fundamental transformation in human history, the moment when our species decided to trust its own capacity for discovery over the comfortable certainties of tradition. The pestilence had asked us a question that no previous generation had been forced to confront. When everything you believe about the world proves inadequate to explain what you are experiencing, Do you cling to the familiar lies, or embrace the terrifying truth? We had chosen truth, and that choice had changed everything. Standing in the entrance of the cave, looking out over the valley where lights now twinkled in villages that had been rebuilt according to new principles of health and community, I understood that the Renaissance had not been caused by the rediscovery of ancient Greek texts or the patronage of wealthy merchants. It had been born in moments like this, when ordinary people, faced with extraordinary circumstances, chose to ask new questions rather than accept old answers. When they decided that human beings were capable of understanding the world through their own efforts rather than simply accepting what authorities told them. The Black Death had been our teacher, though it was the cruelest teacher imaginable. It had forced us to see that the emperor of medieval certainty wore no clothes, that the elaborate structures of knowledge and authority that had seemed so solid were actually built on foundations of ignorance and fear. But in destroying those false certainties, it had given us something infinitely more valuable, the freedom to discover truth for ourselves. As I made my way back down the hill toward Florence, I carried with me not just the memory of what we had accomplished, but a vision of what humanity might become. A species that valued questions more than answers, that celebrated discovery more than tradition, that understood that the greatest act of faith was not blind acceptance, but the courage to see the world as it truly is. The stars wheeled overhead in their eternal patterns, indifferent to human suffering and triumph alike. But under those stars, in cities and villages across Europe, people were asking new questions, making new discoveries, building new ways of living that honored both the beauty of creation and the dignity of human intelligence. The future stretched ahead of us, unknown and full of possibility. And for the first time in human history, we had the tools and the courage to shape that future consciously, deliberately, with our own hands and minds. The Black Death had ended, the Renaissance had begun, and we were no longer the same species that had cowered in ignorance when the plague first arrived. We had become something new, human beings who dared to question, to observe, to experiment, to dream of a world transformed by knowledge rather than constrained by fear. The transformation was complete. The future belonged to us.